So let us call to order the February 26, 2013 meeting of the Santa Barbara City Council Finance Committee. We will begin with public comment. Are there any members of the public wishing to speak on topics not on today's agenda but within the jurisdiction of this committee? Seeing none, let us go to the first agenda item. Ms. Bjork.
Good afternoon, members of Finance Committee. I'm Rebecca Bjork. I'm the Water Resources Manager. And today I have with me Sudhir Pardiwala, who is a consultant with Raftellus Financial Consultants, who has done our rate evaluation for us. I'm going to start out our presentation and then turn it over to Sudhir for some of the more technical explanation. I did want you to know that we have been working on this rate review since about June of last year, and we have been working closely with Water Commission on the development and review of rate modifications. We've taken it, we had a member of the Water Commission who volunteered to participate with staff and did participate in staff meetings with the consultant and provide input, as well as taking it twice to our Water Commission for their review, input, and participation. One of our members of Water Commission was planning to be here today. I don't see her. Oh, there she is. She should be in, and I'd like to offer her an opportunity to speak on behalf of the Water Commission. She's actually not formally speaking for them, as they didn't have a chance. They didn't know anyone would be available to come at the time. But Megan Burney is one of our members. And Megan, if you'd like to, I'm sorry to put you on the spot just as you walk in, but if you'd like to make any comments on behalf of Water Commission. After the staff report? Yeah. Okay, we'll do that after the staff report. Thanks. Okay, great. Thank you. You can. We'll get you after. Thank you. So today we're going to go over our water financial plan, which is our 10-year look ahead at what we believe our revenue needs to meet the operations, maintenance, debt requirements, and capital needs for the water fund. Our water rate calculation, design objectives, and proposed changes. Our water and wastewater connection fees. Those are the fees that new customers pay when they buy into the system. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about wastewater and what we're proposing to do with wastewater rates, and we will be looking for a Finance Committee recommendation. Starting into the water financial plan, we do a 10-year look ahead to see what a 10-year rate plan would be. We last did it in 2004, I believe, so we're very much due. The key assumptions in looking at the 10-year financial plan are that there will be an inflation rate of approximately 3% per year, that our growth assumptions in terms of new customers and new demand were made consistent with the general plan. We have developed a plan for our capital program that we believe meets critical system needs. 10 years is a long way out to do capital planning, so by the time we get to the end of the financial plan, it's not as clear as what we're doing the first couple of years, but we've done our best to try and look at least level of effort and what we believe we'll need. We do expect to have decreasing sales, and we're expecting about 1% total demand reduction per year. So not only are we looking at needing increasing revenue, we need it with less sales. So that puts additional rate pressure on the water sales. And we are anticipating an average of 1.8% return on investment for invested money. So those were the basic assumptions of looking at what the revenue needs would be for the water fund. Using those, the rate adjustments that are being recommended, Raftellus did this evaluation for us, are 3% at the beginning, creeping up to 4% by 2022. Again, this is a 10-year plan. We would expect to come back to you hopefully in 5 years or so with a review of it, especially as we have a better understanding of what our new capital is. We have a lot of things that change in the water fund, especially demand, so making modifications as we go along. But at this point in time, this is our best estimate of what we're looking at for a 10-year revenue need. I wanted to show you, I don't expect you to see this whole chart, but I wanted you to see it. This is the capital demand that is really the biggest driver in the additional revenue. It's partly the biggest driver is in that it's the only thing we have much discretionary control over. The operation and maintenance costs are really driven by demand and the need to treat and provide water. The debt service we're obligated to, so the capital need is really the variable. You can see that we're ranging from $11 million in this next fiscal year to a more typical of sort of $5 to $7 million capital program. And then in fiscal year 2022, we have a big reservoir project that we believe we may need to start to work on, which bumps us up to about $14 million. Again, this is our best estimate at this point in time. Things come up a lot in an operating a utility like the water system, so this will change, but we believe this is a good approximation of the level of revenue that we will be needing. Using that financial plan, I wanted to show you what our reserve balance look like. You can see we have a lot of money in reserves right now. That's not an accident. We've been basically saving up. We have a big project to do in fiscal year 14, which is the recycled water filter replacement project, which we're expecting to budget almost $7 million for. And we are also allocating additional money to our main replacement program because we have not been funding that completely because of competing needs for our water capital money and other things that have needed to be done. I do want to mention, as you look at this, on the last slide, excuse me, I went the wrong way. All of that capital is planning to be cash funded. In the last decade, we have done 3 significant projects in the water fund just for compliance with one water quality rule, which have cost us about $60 million. We have debt funded those. We really are at our limit for debt capacity at this point in time, so all of our financial planning is assuming cash funding of the capital as we go ahead. That's appropriate, as most of what you see on this board is really annual programs of work. So it's an annual allocation of money, like the main replacement, maintaining our distribution reservoirs, maintaining our pump stations. Those aren't things we would typically debt fund anyway, as they have an annual investment that we're making, as opposed to something like the filter plant, which we are going to cash fund, but would expect to have about a 20-year life over which to recoup the value of that asset.
Question about that. So you have this big reservoir project. Is that Lauro at the end?
It's actually one Escondido.
Okay. And so wouldn't that typically be a debt-funded?
By the time we get to fiscal year 2022, I expect that would be one of the questions we'd be looking at.
Okay.
And I want to say that big project at the end really isn't driving the rest of the financial plan, in that rate increases do become cumulative, but once you get out to the very end like that, it's not having an effect on anything.
Okay.
So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Sudhir Pardawala with Raftellus, but I wanted to just talk a little bit about how we have worked with Raftellus in helping to determine the rate design for our water rates, our customers. We had several objectives as staff and working with Water Commission in trying to develop rate design. We wanted to continue to provide as affordable water as we can to meet basic lifeline needs. So the very first unit of water to meet indoor basic needs, if you're being very careful, we tried to keep as cost effective as possible. We wanted to continue to incentivize water conservation, and water rates are one of our best ways to incentivize conservation. So we want to make sure that people's usage sends a signal to them about how they're using their water. We wanted to structure irrigation. We have a number of customers in the distribution system who have irrigation meters. We wanted them to be also careful of their use and using it as needed to maintain their plants and landscape, but being cognizant of weather demand and using it as needed for plant, but having some way of giving a feedback of when they're using too much. And we made changes there. You'll hear about that. We wanted to make sure that our commercial rates reflected the fact that, unlike residential, we really have quite an ability for conservation. Commercial has a much more flat need, in that they've basically, for business reasons, usually done the conservation they can to start with, and most of their demand is generally driven by whatever their business is. So during periods of drought, we are able to buffer our expenses by reducing demand and not having to go and buy as much water, but that means that we aren't able to get as much of a response from commercial. That means that the cost of supporting commercial is actually higher than the cost of supporting residential. And we wanted to assure compliance with Prop 218. I don't have it on here. I thought we'd add it, but we also wanted to make sure that we continued to support local agriculture. And at this point, I will turn it over to Mr. Pardawala.
Thank you. Again. So having looked at the financial plan, which gives us revenue adjustments, the next step in the process then is to identify how we go about collecting that revenue from our customers, which is identifying the rates. And what we do is we follow basic industry standards proposed by the American Water Works Association, cost of service principles to come up with the rates for these different customer classes, consistent with some of the objectives that Rebecca just identified. So when we look at meter charges, these are the fixed revenues that you recover from rates, the fixed part of the revenues. They're composed of two components. One is a customer service component, which is constant for all meter sizes and covers such things as meter billing, revenue collections, customer service, and so forth. These costs are constant for all the customers. And the second part of that charge is a meter charge or a capacity charge, which is proportional to the demand put by the different meters, and that is based on the hydraulic capacity of those meters. So when we combine those two different elements of those charges, we come up with the proposed charge for 2013. And as you can see, going to the cost of service analysis, there are some customers that will see increases, some of them significant increases, whereas the 3/4 inch meter, the 1 inch, and up to the 2 inch meter will actually see some small reductions. And what this does essentially is provide an equitable distribution of cost amongst the different meter sizes, consistent with cost of service principles. No problem, I'll take it. So then once we have identified the revenues that we need to recover from the fixed charges, which are the meter charges, the next step is to determine the variable rates. How do we go about defining the variable rates? And so the city currently has 4 units of water consumption for single family and multifamily customers, which provides the basic needs for health and safety. And we are retaining sorry, you have a question?
I do. You said that the rates for the fixed charges, the meter charges, is related to the cost of service.
Right.
Could you elaborate on that a little bit more about in other words, clearly there's more cost that comes in when the water comes through. So what is it, components of the activities of putting in the pipes, or what costs of service are going into that?
We would get into a little bit of technical detail there. So what the methodology that we follow is called the base extra capacity method, and we look at under this method, you take some of the cost of providing service under average conditions, and that falls under what is called base, and this is a variable rate. Then you have the demand components, which are the max day and the max hour. The water system is designed to handle peaks, so when a customer turns on, you get an instant water flow. So, and this peak is based upon the meter size. The larger meters can put a larger demand on the system. And then we looked at those other costs, which we said are fixed for all customers, the billing cost and so forth, customer service costs. So those are separate. So when we look at this demand cost, when we are designing rates, we take a portion of that demand cost and allocate it to the variable rate and part of it to the meter charges. Again, there's two purposes to that. One is to provide the revenue stability, and the other one is to ensure that you have adequate rates, provide an adequate signal for conservation as well. So you don't want to take all of those capacity charges, the demand charges, and put them only on meters. That kind of tends to increase those meter charges. And we also want to follow the California Urban Water Conservation Council has certain guidelines in terms of how much of the revenue you collect from those meter charges. So we look at these various factors and come up with a rate design that kind of appropriately allocates costs. And right now what we are doing is we are allocating about 22% of the total revenues that we are recovering from rates to the meter charges, and the remaining would actually come from the variable rates.
That's helpful. Thank you.
So the next step in the process is looking at the variable rates, and as I was saying, we have provided that retain the current basic essential use for residential customers at the 4 units, and that's the first year rate that would be assigned to residential customers. Then having reviewed the water usage, in the last few years we have seen that there has been significant conservation and so forth. So we have identified that we can potentially reduce that second tier you're currently providing 16 units of usage in that second tier. We were proposing to reduce it to 14 units for single family customers, and for multifamily customers, because they don't really have the irrigation usage, we are proposing to reduce the usage in the second tier from 8 units to 4 units. And so if you look at the table below, what you see are the rates that we are proposing for different classes of different tiers in the residential for the residential customers. Tier 1, there's a small increase of 4 cents per unit of water. Tier 2 will actually see a reduction, and Tier 3 will see a significant increase. Again, that is considered non-discretion or non-essential usage, more discretionary, and so we are trying to pass on that stronger signal for conservation. Now, these rates were basically determined by looking at the various sources of water that you have. So we assign the lowest cost water available to that first tier, and then there are some elements of the next few sources of water. We have about 4 or 5 different sources of water. So we look at each of those sources of water and assign to the different customers and to the different tiers. And this is how we came up with the different rates for these different classes. We did want to make sure that we have a significant differential between Tier 2 and Tier 3 so that you are sending that signal for conservation.
Sure.
I have a question, and I probably should know this, but I'll ask it. So for the multifamily residents, I understand if it's a condo, then each individual unit has its own water bill.
Right.
But if it's an apartment complex with a common landlord, is it under 1 meter or is it individual meters? How do you calculate that?
It's based on the number of dwelling apartments. So if you have 10 apartments, then they would get 40 units in the first tier, and then the next 4 units. So again, another 40 units in the second tier, and anything over the 80 units would fall in the third tier. Then.
So it's a cumulative.
Right, it's cumulative.
For whether it's a condo or an apartment complex?
Right, that's right. It's
Okay.
per dwelling
No.
unit.
No, I'm sorry. It depends on when it was built, basically.
Okay.
For newer buildings, they all have their own meters, but where they have a shared meter, then it's based on the number of dwelling units.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chair, to follow up
Yes,
on that.
Mr. White.
So what portion of apartments, can you specify how many apartments have collective meters and how many have individual meters in ballpark numbers?
I would need to ask my technical staff, Teresa Lancy, who's our water resources specialist, if she has that information. I'm not sure we have that. Do you have it in just general terms, Teresa?
Well, in general, the meter ordinance was implemented in the early 90s, but I would say the number.
Yeah.
So the number of meters, I don't know off the top of my head, but I would say that there's not a very many of master metered residences left out of the whole multifamily classification. I would say probably it's about a 30-70 split of master metered versus each having their own.
Okay, thank you.
We have identified the rates for residential customers, single family and multifamily. So here are the tiers, basically first 4 units, the next 14 and for single family, and then everything else over 18 units would fall in the third tier. Similarly for multifamily, the first 4 units at the lowest rate, the next 4 units at the second rate, and then anything over 8 units falls under the third tier. Then we specifically looked at the commercial industrial customers. As we identified earlier, there are some considerations that we have to take in terms of the water, especially during drought situations and so forth. And so we've identified what those rates for the commercial industrial customers are. Commercial tier 1 they are allocated. That first tier basically takes into consideration the average usage from January to June, and then anything over that would fall in the second tier. So basically, it takes into consideration the demand factors that arise for the usage that falls outside of that average usage. That would be the additional usage, and that would be charged at the higher rate.
A question about that. So what you're saying is that Tier 1 for the industrial users is keyed to each individual business's usage?
Right.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Yeah, each one would have a separate allocation
Okay.
based on their average usage during that base period of January to June. And it's always important to see what kind of impact result from these changes in the rates. And what this slide shows you are some of the impacts to different levels of usage for single-family residential customers, which are of most interest most often to to us. And so, as you can see, for customers, very low usage customers that use less or use 4 units a month, they would see an increase of 78 cents, as displayed in the second last column there, per month. The low usage customers using up to 8 units of water would see a small increase of 42 cents a month. And then a customer that is using 12 units would actually see an increase of only 6 cents a month. But as you get into, once you have exceeded that basic allowance that we have provided for, anything that is more discretionary would wind up seeing more impacts. And so when somebody that is using 32 units of water, which is above our basic allocation of that 18 units, would see a significant increase, $15, which represents an 8% compared to the average 3% revenue adjustment that we are looking at. And then a very high usage customer using a lot more water would see a much higher increase. And this chart then shows you the number of customers that actually fall within those different levels of usage. So for example, very low 0 to 4 units, that represents about 21% of the total bills that are issued on an average in the city. And the first 3 up, very low, low, and moderate usage, represents about 70% of the total usage or 70% of the total bills in the city. So there are 30% of the customers that would actually see some significant increases to their water bills under the proposed rates. One of the elements that we spent quite a bit of time on in the study is looking at the irrigation rates, reviewing how we should be charging irrigation customers. Currently, the city has fixed allocations for these irrigation customers, irrespective of what the weather looks like. And what we wanted to do was to ensure that irrigation customers, which typically use a lot of water is used for irrigation, generally speaking, we wanted to ensure that they're using water efficiently. And so what we did is we tied their allocations, instead of having flat allocations, we actually tied it to the weather patterns, and I'll go through that here in a second, how we determine that, and the actual acreage that they have. So each customer, depending upon the area that he has, and the city has that database already identified, and looking at the actual weather, each customer will have a separate allocation. One of the other things that we did during the course of the study was simplified some of the irrigation customers. So we combined the residential and the commercial irrigation customers. Again, these are only for customers that have separate irrigation meters. And because the third bullet specifically talks about currently there's a carryover policy, because we did not have those allocations tied to the weather, we are saying that we don't need to have that carryover policy anymore, because during dry conditions their allocations will actually increase and so forth. So we are going to have them try to incentivize the efficient use of water during different weather conditions. And just to give you a brief idea as to how we go about calculating the weather data, the city, there is an institution called the California CIMIS, California Irrigation Management Information System, that has weather stations all over the state. And there are several in Santa Barbara, but the one that we are referring to is station number 107. And what this does, it provides you data on the level of usage that is required for cool season turf, that is represented by ET0 or evapotranspiration. And so everything is then based on this ET0 data that we would collect on a daily basis from these weather stations. So shrubs would have, for example, a certain percentage, say 30% of this ET0. Avocados would have 75% of ET0, and so forth. This represents the amount of water that is required on a daily basis for these different types of landscape that customers might have. And so we have identified the level of usage for different customers based upon their expected level of the type of shrubs that they have for commercial, residential, commercial, for irrigation, like such as pot, which have a lot of turf, and for agricultural users, which have avocado grows, for example. So based on the ET data, the type of plants that they have, and the acreage, we've identified the allocation for different classes of customers. And what you will see here is that we've identified on a monthly basis as well as the annual basis, the usage that we would expect based on weather, and this is based on the average weather conditions over the last 20 years. And this identifies the amount of water that would be used per irrigation, the amount of water being represented by 100 cubic feet. So for example, for residential commercial customers, they would get a monthly allocation based on an average 68 units of each unit being 100 cubic feet per acre of irrigated area. Compare the annual usage, which is shown in the second column there of numbers, to the current annual budget, and you will see that each class of customers actually will have the allocation increase under the proposed methodology. But again, this allocation will change with the weather pattern. So when you have wet weather, the allocation will drop so that we will incentivize more efficiency. And when you have drier conditions, the allocation will tend to increase, and they would be actually able to use more water. So the irrigation rates, again, we have looked at 3 different classes of customers. I'd like to point to the bottom one first, the agricultural customers, recognizing that this is the city wanted to ensure that you do continue to have ag usage and provide them water. What we have done is we have provided them the lowest cost source of water, and so their rates in that first year, if they use an efficient level of usage, they will actually see a very small increase of 6 cents from $1.45 to $1.51 per unit of water. Now, if they exceed that allocation that is provided to them, then those rates will increase significantly. So it goes from 151 all the way up to the third tier rate for residential customers, which is 662. Now, when we look at residential commercial customers, basically what we have done is we have tied because we are looking at non-essential usage, we have tied the usage for landscape to the tier 2 residential rate, which is $5.16, and the third tier, which is in excess of their allocation, would be charged the highest rate. For parks and schools, again, recognizing that they are a public use, we have used, again, the different sources of water cost to allocate to provide water at a reasonable rate to those customers, as long as they're using water within their allocation. And that rate would increase from $2.47 to $2.70, increase of slightly less than 10%. Again, if they exceed their allocation, they'll be charged the highest rate. So all of these rates are designed to provide that incentive for conservation, try to ensure efficient usage. Oh, and the recycled water rate is the current policy of the city is to charge 80% of the basic rate, which is the tier 1 rate, and we have retained that policy, and that rate would increase from $1.98 to $2.16. And then outside city customers, the city currently has a policy of charging those customers at 130% of the inside city rates, and we actually went through an analysis that I'll talk about, and we are recommending that we stay with that policy. So what we did when we reviewed the outside city customers, you do have 11% of your customers are outside the city, but they do have a significant amount of infrastructure that is dedicated to providing service to those customers. And so we actually looked at, identified what this infrastructure is and how much it costs to maintain this infrastructure, and identified those costs to come up with this 130%. What we actually came up with is a slightly higher number than 130%, but given the fact that some of these are estimates and so forth, we decided to retain the existing differential. We do have one customer that is which is surrounded by the city, which is the Earl Warren Showgrounds. And because it does not use any additional facilities, this one individual customer, actually, even though it's not part of the city, we are recommending that it stay with the same rates as the city rate, because it does not really use any of the infrastructure that we talked about in terms of the other classes of customers that are outside the city. Another element of the study was to identify the fire line charges, and these are charges that customers, private customers, basically to provide private fire service. We have public fire hydrants and we have private fire services, and we've looked at the overall cost of providing the fire service and allocated those costs between public and private. And based on those allocations, what we have done is identified the cost to serve different meter sizes, proportional again to the demand that they would put on the fire service system. As you can see, most customers will see some increases. The 1.5 inch and the 2 inch meters will actually see small reductions in their fire service charges. Again, consistent with cost of service principles, we are trying to increase the equity that is to make sure that those costs are fairly allocated amongst the different fire services in the city.
Mr. White.
So this is a fixed meter charge for private fire hydrant.
Right, that's right. Okay. The city does have those. We already have that charge in place right now, but we are, as you can see on the 10-inch line, for example, we are charging a very small fee. A 10-inch line can impose a significant demand on the system, and so we were trying to make sure that they pay the fair share of the cost. We currently don't have a 12-inch fire service line, but just as in case you have something in the future, we've identified what that cost would be as well.
Thank you.
Can someone change their meter size to a private hydrant? So if they have a 10-inch one now and they see that new rate and they want to go down to a 6 or something, and it makes sense, or is it all depending on where they are and what the fire risk
they could
is?
potentially, if they think that they don't need that fire service line, they could install a smaller line. Again, there is a significant cost associated with changing those as well, so you'd have to consider both those factors before.
So they'd have to pay for the capital cost
Right.
in terms of changing that.
Right,
line.
it would
Okay.
have to be their cost, right? Okay. The next element of the study was to review connection fees. And connection fees are basically fees that are charged to new customers to ensure that they are paying their fair share for the system that they are buying into, essentially, or the facilities that they would need to provide service to them. In our case, we are recommending that we use a buy-in fee, which means that we are looking at the existing infrastructure. You do have capacity in your existing infrastructure to provide service to new customers, so we are not looking at adding any additional facilities to provide service to these customers. So what we are doing here is looking at the cost of the existing infrastructure, and the new customers will be buying into the equity that the existing customers have invested in building this infrastructure. So the first line item there looks at the cost of the existing infrastructure, and what we're looking at is the replacement cost less depreciation. They would be buying into this infrastructure that is being maintained, and you're paying the replacement cost of this infrastructure. But it recognizes the fact that because these facilities have been used, we need to depreciate them. So the replacement cost less depreciation of your existing infrastructure is about $236 million on the water side. The new customers will also be buying into the reserves, essentially, that the existing customers have in the system right now, which is $21.8 million. And so the sum of those two represents the value of the existing infrastructure. But some of this infrastructure was funded by debt, and the city is continuing to pay off this debt. So the principal associated with this debt will be shared by these new customers when they come online. And so we reduce the value of that infrastructure by the amount of the debt, principal of the debt. And that gives us a net asset value of $213 or $214 million, essentially. When we look at, to come up with the unit cost to determine how much we should charge new customers, we did what is the usage in the system right now. And currently, the total usage in the system is about 10.75 million gallons per day. And so we take that asset value and to divide it by that usage number to come up with the unit cost in terms of dollars per GPD or gallons per day. And that works out to $19.90. And if you apply that to an average single-family residential usage of 305 gallons per day, gives you a proposed connection fee of $6,000 and $6,070 compared to the existing $5,691. So this basically allows the existing users to recover their equity in the system through the collection of these connection fees from new users. And then the fee that you currently recover from these customers can be used towards the capital costs that the city is incurring as it goes down the road. So the fee is increasing by less than about 5%, $379 when you look at the current fee, a little bit more than 5% over the current connection fee. We go through the same kind of analysis on the wastewater side, where we look at the current asset value, replacement cost, less depreciation, add the reserves, and subtract the principal to come up with a net asset value of $146 million. The flow into the system is about 7.35 MGD, and so the unit cost works out pretty much the same, $19.9 per GPD. And the amount of wastewater that is generated by a single-family residence is about 250 gallons per day. And so the proposed connection fees is slightly under $5,000, $49.77. This represents a slightly higher increase, $859 over the current connection fee of $4,100. And the last slide basically shows, how we should charge other customers other than single-family residences. So on the water side, it's actually based on, we would be looking at the meter sizes, even for single-family customers. If a larger single-family customer would have, if you have a 1-inch customer, they would actually pay the 1-inch fee. The cost was actually determined for the lowest size meter. And these charges are all proportional to the demand that these different meter sizes place on the system. Again, this is consistent with the way the city currently charges its customers. On the wastewater side, the single-family fee is the $49.77, and because that is not proportional to the meter size for residential customers, all single-family customers would pay the $49.77, but commercial customers with larger meters or different size meters would pay the different fees. I just wanted to make sure that we understand the difference between the water and the wastewater fees for residential customers. Again, both the water as well as the wastewater connection fees, the way we charge the different size customers would remain consistent with what the city is doing right now. Okay. And that basically completes my part of the presentation. And Rebecca will address the wastewater rates.
Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to speak briefly about wastewater. We are not proposing significant changes this year to the wastewater rate structure. We did ask Raftellus to do an evaluation of cost of service for the wastewater rate structure, and their preliminary results suggest a fairly substantial shift from the residential in revenue source, from the residential to the commercial sector. There are a number of things in there that we want to evaluate further, and additionally, we believe that if such a shift is warranted, because the cost of service really reflects that, we need more time to talk to our customers and let them know what is going on and what we're proposing. Because of the timeline for adopting this year's rates, we really don't have time to do that additional analysis or to do the outreach that we believe we need to do. So we're proposing this year to keep with what we've been doing for the last several years of a across-the-board 4% rate increase. So keep the same rate structure and use this coming year to do additional analysis and do additional outreach as necessary to try and let our customers know what's going on. The wastewater rates are based on the waste strength and the waste volume. So we need to make sure that the assumptions about waste strength for our customers are similar to the published or industry standards. And so we want to spend some more time on that. So we are not recommending significant changes there. I do expect questions, and we certainly hope to have time to talk about questions, but I did want to finish the presentation by letting you know where we are today, what we're asking this committee for, and also how we will go forward with making changes to water and wastewater rates. Today, we are asking the committee to recommend to Council the proposed changes to the water rate structure. Those will be heard at Council in 2 weeks, at which time we're asking Council to give us authorization to send out a Prop 218 rate notice, which would advise our customers of potential changes. Rates would not actually be changed or adopted until June. We are required to do a 45-day noticing, and in order to get that time, we need to start now. We are asking that the Finance Committee recommend to Council adoption of the 10-year financial plan, and we would present that for adoption at the Council meeting in 2 weeks. We are asking the Finance Committee to recommend the water and wastewater buy-in fees. However, those would not be adopted until June. And that we are asking the Finance Committee to provide recommendation to Council on the 4% across-the-board wastewater rate increase, which again would not be adopted until June. So I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Questions from committee members? Oh, yes, actually. We have our representative from the Water Commission here.
Good afternoon. My name is Megan Burney. I'm on the Water Commission, and simply here today to thank staff and Raftellus for their excellent work. We really felt that they went above and beyond, reaching out to the committee and also to the stakeholders in the community to ensure that everybody fully understood these different rate changes and how it would impact their place of business. We thought they did an excellent job ensuring basic water access for all with those low first-tier rates, and then also emphasizing conservation and efficiency with the higher-tier rates. And we did support staff recommendations on all accounts, and felt that the rate increases were important to keep up with an aging infrastructure.
Thank you, Ms. Burney.
Thank you.
Any questions? Thank you. Mr. White?
Yeah. Thank you. And I appreciate Ms. Burney waiting around for us to hear the staff presentation before making your comments. To be able to read my comments, so I was reading part of WALA. I was trying to figure out what that meant. Okay. Okay. First of all, I'm sorry that Ms. Murillo isn't here because one of her areas of passion is with the steelhead and the steelhead trout and all of that. And I'm imagining that if water gets allocated to the steelhead, I'm imagining that would have an upward push on rates. And would that affect, so I'd appreciate your responding to that question of would an allocation of water, we'll use some allocation, significant, 5%, 10%, that kind of range. Would that have an influence on rates? And secondly, would that drive the rates at the bottom tiers? Would it increase those rates, or would it simply be the grand estates that would be hit with the extra charge?
Maybe I just want to say one thing. I think Rebecca is probably in a better situation to handle the question. Basically, when water gets allocated for trout, for example, what it will do is it will reduce the total amount of water that you will be able to get from the state water project. And what that would do then is constrain the supplies. And so again, when we get into a drought mode, so to speak, and that would, because you're selling less water, then it has an upward impact on the rates.
Councilmember White, without doing another complete cost of service, without knowing what reductions to supply there are, and without doing another cost of service analysis, we wouldn't be able to precisely answer your question. However, in the rate cost allocation that Mr. Pardawala explained, a substantial portion of the Tier 2 rates would need to move to a different supply. And so currently, our most significant supply is Kachuma. So if we have a significant reduction of Kachuma supply, and Kachuma is fairly affordable water, if we have a significant reduction in that, we will be moving more to less affordable water, State Water Project. Groundwater we use pretty much based on its availability, although it can be fairly expensive to treat. But I think that the biggest cost driver would be if there was enough of a reduction, and this would go for any of our supplies, if there was enough of a reduction in any of our supplies that we needed to develop a new supply, then I would expect costs to be very significant.
Sure.
As to your question about would it affect the baseline rate, just without having done analysis and without knowing what we're talking about, I think we could probably protect that baseline rate, but I think the Tier 2 rate would likely be affected.
Okay, great. Thank you. Next, this is kind of in the same vein. Where the long-term water supply plan envisions Kachuma, a change of rates when Kachuma hits 100,000 acre feet. Do you have any? Was there any work done on what those rate changes would be in that event when that does occur?
The long-term supply plan and the 100,000 acre feet storage goes to the issue of Kachuma being a multi-year supply. And we are currently in the second year after a spill at Kachuma. And I project that, given our dry year, that we will probably be at 100,000 or less by the end of this water year, which is the end of September. It doesn't affect our cost of water. It affects availability of water, which ultimately does affect cost of water, but it won't affect rates. It will just mean that we are more reliant on more expensive water supplies, but also, as you recall, the long-term supply plan asks for conservation to offset the need for the more expensive water supplies. What a drought will do is reduce revenue, and the ability of the water fund to absorb reductions in revenue can be buffered, one, by the use of reserves, or two, by deferring capital. We are having a fairly good year this year in terms of revenue. We've had more water sales than we were expecting because it's been dry. I'm getting ahead of this a little bit, but our plan would be to budget the use of that revenue for capital, since we have existing capital need, with the understanding that if we had revenue go away, if we saw a reduction in revenue, that we would have some ability to buffer that by changing our capital program.
That would be too bad. Finally, Mr. Chair, thank you for your patience. I felt like the numbers you were using for the values of the system sounded low to me, and I'm wondering what you valued the Gibraltar Reservoir at.
I can pull the
I'm
numbers
figuring
out.
that's a $100 million system,
Right.
at least as it is.
When we look at these reservoirs, some of these reservoirs were put in many, many years ago. So when you're looking at the depreciated value
All of
of
them.
the reservoir, that's where the reservoir value would tend to get corrected. So if you had a new reservoir of that size, you would wind up with a pretty high value. I can go and look at, if you're interested in looking at the actual value that we included in our analysis, but we do take into consideration depreciation.
Yeah. Well, it seemed like both that, and then my recollection, even when the sewage treatment plant was built in the 70s, my recollection was that even in those dollars then, it was $100 million, between $100 and $150 million 40 years ago, or 35 or whatever it was. So that the $159 million for the wastewater system sounds low as well. And so, and again, the buy-in, that was used to back into the buy-in rates. And if you look at buy-in, I believe, and that would be interesting for us to see in 2 weeks, how we're comparing to other jurisdictions. My recollection is that those are very low, but that would be handy to have that comparison when we look at that at the council level. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Certainly. Ms. Schneider.
Could you go back to the water capital program slide? It was towards the beginning. Yeah. So on Gibraltar Dam and the siltation that's occurring there, that seems to be a long-term issue about water supply and the capacity of the reservoir. And that amount of money there doesn't seem like that's addressing that issue. Is that correct? Is that something that needs additional study? That could be a future capital need?
Member Schneider, that money that's reflected there is for some fairly basic maintenance of facilities at Gibraltar. It doesn't anticipate any substantial projects at Gibraltar. Our near-term plan for maintaining capacity at Gibraltar is to continue with the pass-through agreement that we negotiated in 1989 with the other users of the San Ynez River to allow us to store Gibraltar water in surplus capacity at Cachuma. And we believe that that will help to minimize Gibraltar losses and stabilize our yield, at least in the near term of the next 10 years, at about current levels. As Gibraltar continues to silt, the ability to use it decreases. I do plan, and you won't see it in capital here, but I do have it in my preliminary budget for next year's work to start to look at issues of sedimentation on Gibraltar and just start to try and get a handle of what are the variables and what are the opportunities for addressing that. It is part, as you know, part of the long-term supply plan to do that work, and so we will be moving ahead with that work. So that may result in a change, should that come forward with some reasonable project that looks like it has a better outcome than the pass-through agreement, then you might see that budgeted in a future year. But at this point in time, we still need to do the assessment.
Okay, and then on that same slide, the unfunded projects, are we looking for grants to meet those?
The unfunded portion of the unfunded projects on that slide are the unfunded, are estimates of how much we are not funding the main replacement, assuming a main program of 1% per year. So we make certain assumptions about the main program cost per foot replacement and calculate how much money it would cost to do basically 3 miles of pipe a year, and then the unfunded portion is the difference between what we've budgeted and what we think we would have needed to budget to keep up with that. The main replacement is a ongoing incremental program, so it has some ability to size it to meet budget needs. I'm pleased that we've had the ongoing program because just doing it year after year really has value, and we've certainly tried to fully fund it to the extent we can, but that's what you're seeing in those unfunded portions.
Okay. And then with the Earl Warren Showgrounds, do they know that the proposal is not to charge them the extra percentage, even though they're not technically in the city? Did someone tell them?
They are aware of the proposal, and I actually expected them to be here today, but they have come to Water Commission to make comment.
Great, because I know that that's been a topic of interest for them, so that's, I think, good news for them. Yeah. And then could you go to the pie chart?
I have to remember which way it was.
Go forward. It's a few slides.
Thank you.
Keep going a little bit. There you go. Okay. So normally, I'm moving towards how do you communicate all this information to the public, because it's a lot of information. And typically we would say there's going to be an X percentage increase, a 3% or 2.5% or whatever. And while some very low, and you had the rates depending on what level whether you're single family or multifamily. It's really all over the board about what they're actually going to see. And what it appears like the low and moderate amounts are actually going to see a slight decrease, which is 50% plus, half of the users. So, and then the 21% very low see a 3% increase, and then it's really, like you said, that 30% that may see a significant increase. And then on top of that, the irrigation, the agricultural rates are very minimal, 6 cents or something like that. So that kind of messaging, I know you need to, I was looking at the notice of public hearing that proposed to come out. You need to put all the details in here per 218, but I'm wondering if just some general statement of this is different than normal, this is not across the board increase, half of you will probably see a very slight decrease. I mean, some kind of general statements like that, so then they can really get a general overview and then look at the specifics about their own scenario. But because I think this is, and this won't happen again, assuming we move forward with this 10-year rate structure plan after this next year, then we'll talk about a 3% across the board or whatever the number is, right?
That's correct. I do want to mention that although the unit rates are going down, our projection for a basic bill will still be a small increase. And I did want to reflect that one of the concerns of Water Commission was that they did not believe that sending the message of rates going down was the right message to send, and they were concerned about that, and I know that they wanted to have that expressed here. The cost of service allocation means that we were looking at it a little differently, and it's the way it came out in terms of supporting cost of service, but I did want you to know that they had that concern.
Okay. I get that. I agree with that. I think somehow how we communicate this to, and this is part of it, how we communicate this to the public about this is unusual than what you would typically see in a 218 water rate notice. Just like a preamble, I don't know, something, because this can get quite confusing, and people just want to basically, well, what does it mean for my house, or what does it mean for my business? So that was just a comment there. Thank you.
Good point. Any further questions? If not, I would entertain a motion on the 4 recommendations.
I have a comment, Mr. Chair.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And then public comment. Yeah.
Are there any members of the public wishing to comment on this? Please come forward.
Did I hear you?
Yeah.
Sorry, I was late. Just a couple of items. I applaud Rebecca and her staff for.
Sir, could you
giving
please introduce yourself for the
diligent
record?
attention To the
What's your name?
Steve Little. I'm the president of the Westwood Hills. A little bit lame Avocado Association. Madam Mayor, Chairman, and gentlemen, I appreciate the opportunity to speak a couple of words. First of all, I was privileged to a presentation by the staff of Rebecca, and introduced me to the words of wisdom about the agricultural rate and the allocation. And the allocation that was finally achieved was first proposed by myself and your fellow colleague there back in 1995 with 3.5 acre-feet per acre. And we kind of got along with that for some time when we had a carryover provision. And so if you didn't use all the water in this year, you got carried over to the next year. Well, that was a good substitute for the 3.5 acre-feet per acre. But finally, we've got the 3.5 acre-feet per acre on the budget. So we go forward from there. Now, the rate increase is something that you folks will decide in council. It's not a big increase. It's something that we don't think is necessary, but that's all right. We sort of got a compromise going here with achieving of 3.5 acre-feet per acre and a small increase in the water rate. So that's about where we stand right now, and I'm glad to see that we've addressed the Prop 218 in writing. The last time I heard Prop 218 mentioned was by this gentleman here who had an occasion to speak about it at the council meeting. And with that, I will close. Any questions? I'm glad to answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Mr. White?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, I apologize. I do have one last question,
Certainly.
and that is on the water pipes themselves. We've had now most of 30 years of replacement of the policy of replacing 1% a year, not having been reached a bunch of the time, but at least that's been the goal. Is there a change in the break? I mean, I don't know what the test is for effectiveness of the pipes. That is to say, are they holding up? And have the replacements that have occurred already, has that resulted in an improvement in our pipes from the standpoint of breaking or whatever the other dependability, utility criteria are?
Councilmember White, when we started the main replacement, we were able to replace the worst of the worst, and so of course we saw a very quick reduction in number of pipe breaks per year. At council, I will have for you an updated amount of how much we've done over that 30-year period so that you'll have that information. I looked at it a few years ago. We managed to keep up more or less, not quite, but pretty close. We have seen a stabilization of the number of breaks. We were, I think, and I'd have to look at this, but I think we're up over 200 breaks a year. We're down in the 60 range. It's strangely weather dependent. People think of pipes breaking and when it freezes. Just the change in temperature can affect the material that the pipes are made out of. There are some opportunities coming up, I hope, in the field, in that the techniques for extending pipe life in terms of doing pipe rehabilitation as opposed to replacement seem to be progressing. They're not here yet, but we continue to watch that. But the shorter, after the long answer to your question, is that we've stabilized, and we've been stabilized for a good number of years. So we are not seeing further reduction, but we also saw a substantial reduction from the initial starting point.
And is that meeting whatever state and federal criteria for breaks?
One of the things that we are trying to find out is sort of a benchmark for breaks. Right. And it is there isn't a standard for breaks. They are expensive and they do result in water loss. So both of those are concerned to us. But we are trying to find similar cities that are both geographically, age, and climatologically similar, so that we can try and get a sense of how we're operating. It's a little difficult to find the right people to benchmark yourself, but we're certainly keeping an eye on our own data and trying to make sure that we're managing that.
Thank you. And the reason I raise that is that it has always concerned me when we're falling behind on those systems, and the fact that we're planning. It's like our streets, where we're planning on not meeting that objective again. And it's not by a lot, but it's by 10% going forward. We're gonna replace 0.9% per year instead of 10%. And I'm disappointed that we're not trying to at least hit the 1% going forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Did you want to make a motion?
I would like to hear a motion from someone.
Well, I would move that the Finance Committee forward to the Council the package as proposed today and recommend approval.
Second.
Very good. Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries. Thank you very much, both of you. Meeting adjourned.